I hope that we will have many future such discussions, is my colleague, Professor Tarek El-Aris, the chair of the Middle Eastern Studies program, whom I work with very closely and teach with, who was on the phone with me, very upset this past weekend, and suggested that we should gather as faculty and hold an academic forum to talk about what has been happening. Professor El-Aris is just on his way back from Cairo from a Dartmouth program, but he's very much with us in spirit, and I thank him. I want to thank the co-sponsors of these gatherings. First, in prime, President Sian Bailak, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Elizabeth Smith, who's here with us today, the Dean of the College, Scott Brown, the Vice President for Institutional Diversity and Equity, Shante Delarue, the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, Victoria Holt and her staff, who've been extraordinary in setting up the facilities and the video live stream for us in very short order, the Government Department, the William Jewett Tucker Center and Reverend Nancy Vogela, who's here, the Hillel at Dartmouth and Rabbi Seth Linfield, who's here, the Ethics Institute, the Leslie Center for the Humanities, and so many faculty colleagues who are here with us today, including faculty who teach or have taught courses on the Middle East. I want to mention in particular the internationally renowned scholar, Professor Dale Eichelman, who's emeritus in the Department of Anthropology, Professor Rachel Feldman, who is a new colleague in the Religion Department, Professor Jean Garthwaite, who may be here, I'm not sure, who's emeritus in the History Department, our colleague Asaf Ben-Tov, who is a visiting professor this year in Jewish Studies, all of whom have taught or are teaching courses relevant to our topic and who would be excellent resources for students and faculty to consult, to talk to in their offices or go out for coffee, and I encourage everyone to do that. I want to emphasize that it's crucial in holding these kinds of discussions that all voices are allowed to be heard and that students, faculty, community members who hold views that may differ from our own are allowed to speak them without fear of harassment or recrimination. We need to remember to express our views without incitement against any group, person, or category, with respect for one another. That is the function of a university. And keep in mind that many of us are feeling emotionally raw and traumatized. We want to emphasize that Hamas does not equal the Palestinian people, and Jews do not equal the Israeli government, and at the same time, there are personal and emotional connections that many of us have. We're gathered here together because horror has come into our lives, because we have been watching and reading about what has transpired this weekend, the massacre of over 1,200 Israelis and citizens of several other countries, citizens of the United States, of Nepal, of France, of Philippines, and certainly of other countries as well. The massacre carried out by Hamas militants, who also killed, among others, 260 young people, the age of our students, at a music festival they were attending in the Negev desert. People killed in their villages, in their farming communities, their kibbutzim, in their homes, on the streets. We're hearing atrocious accounts of rape, of beheading. We're fearful of the fate of the hostages taken to Gaza. We're not entirely sure how many. It may be 150. We don't know the numbers for certain. The hundreds of the Hamas militants who infiltrated Israel were killed, most of them, we assume. And at the same time, hundreds of Palestinian civilians in Gaza have already been killed by Israeli government forces. and the numbers of those killed on both sides, we fear, will continue to rise dramatically. We fear a war is breaking out, and it will be terrible. Many of us at Dartmouth have family and friends and colleagues in Israel and also in Gaza. Some of us have friends who are among the hostages. Some of us have friends who were killed or children of friends who were killed. Some of us have family in Gaza whom we can't reach. All of us fear the danger that Lebanon may be drawn into this war, and possibly other countries and parties. I want to just remind everyone that Dartmouth offers psychological counseling. It's available 24 hours. If you have any difficulty reaching someone for that purpose, please contact your undergraduate dean or get in touch with a faculty member. We all will be able to help you. We also offer chaplains from many different faiths here at Dartmouth, chaplains who will nurture and help you protect your souls. Please take advantage. But we're here today, this afternoon, not as psychologists or as chaplains. We're here for an academic forum to offer our expertise as faculty. We want to stress that our classrooms are places of academic exchange that have functioned for years with respect for our purpose, which is scholarly study. We've achieved a wonderful collaboration and cooperation at Dartmouth College, something extraordinary between the Jewish Studies program and the Middle Eastern Studies program. And we at Dartmouth should be very proud of that cooperation and collaboration, that we co-teach courses, co-sponsor lectures and workshops. And it is for that reason that we're able to come together as faculty for our discussion this afternoon. And we should all be grateful for the high quality of scholarship produced by members of the Dartmouth faculty and their willingness to engage with the community during this highly sensitive and emotional week. I will ask them to introduce ourselves in just a moment. I want to explain some of the procedure this afternoon. Our staff will hand out note cards and pencils to all who come into the auditorium. And if you wish to submit a question, we'll collect those note cards and put them together. Some of the questions will be identical to others, so we're going to collate them. These cards will be given to Professor Bentov, and he will then turn them over to the panel. We also have microphones for you to ask questions from the floor. But if you prefer to put your question in writing rather than stand up, that's fine. We're in no way trying to censor questions, but we're trying to answer as many as we can today. We also have a room in Moore Hall, this building, room B03, that is set up for an overflow crowd where you can watch the discussion on live stream. We are being live streamed now and recorded, and that will be made available at some point. It takes a while. In addition, we have reserved Moore Room 110 as a place where anyone can leave here and go to that room during the discussion if you want to have a quiet space to reflect, to decompress, to cry. And so I now want to turn to our panelists and ask each of us to introduce ourselves. Professor Jonathan Smolin, Professor Ezzedine Fishere, Professor Bernard Avishai. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to our discussion. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Professor Jonathan Smolin. I'm a professor of Middle Eastern Studies here. I've been at Dartmouth since 2005. I have I thought I would share a bit about myself personally as a kind of start here. At a time in which we're seeing such inhumanity, I wanted to share my own experience of humanity in the Middle East and North Africa. I grew up in Center City, Philadelphia, in a Jewish family. And so when I went and lived in Damascus in the year 2000, my family was uncomfortable with this. But it was part of something that I was studying. I was studying Arabic. I was very interested in the Middle East and North Africa. And when you just study the Middle East and North Africa in Arabic in a classroom, there's something cold or something you don't get the full experience, I would say. And so I was in Damascus for the outbreak of the Second Intifada. I was there also for the Bush-Gore election. But I'm telling you this because it was an incredibly challenging time. And there were horrors on the news, in the newspapers and on television screens. But my experience on the streets of Damascus, in the old city, with Syrians, with people, was absolutely exceptional. The humanity of the people that I got to know in cafes, on the streets, on neighbors, it was an overwhelming experience and really propelled me in my life and the things that I do. I went from there to Fez, and I lived in Fez for a couple of years, and I was in Fez in Morocco for 9/11. I watched it happen on TV in my house, and I went out and walked through the old city of the old Medina in Fez. And it was incredibly moving the way that strangers came up to me and hugged me and told me how sorry they were for what happened, and a deep sense of humanity and empathy and connection. And beyond the incredible literature, incredible media, societies, all aspects of civilization that has just become my life, it is truly the humanity of the region in terms of, in moments of crisis, of moments of emotional turbulence, and moments of deep challenge, that has not only bolstered me, but has, frankly, made me the person I am today, and has really directed my life. And so I wanted to just share this element of, this personal element with you as a start, that I'm not just someone who writes books and translates novels and teaches classes, but that I bring with me, sitting here, years of experience in living across the Middle East and North Africa, and with my own humanity transformed and bettered through this experience.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is, as you can see, our second session, and you have to hand it to us that we're perseverant despite everything. My name is Ezzedine Fishere. I teach Middle East politics at the Middle Eastern Studies program. Before coming here, long before coming here, I used to work as a diplomat. I grew up in Egypt, and as a kid, I grew up with pictures of family members that we lost to the war, multiple wars with Israel. My own family, IDPs from the Suez War. So I grew up with all the stereotypes that you can imagine about Israelis and about Jews in general. And then I worked as a diplomat, and my posting, guess where? So I was posted to Israel. And living in Israel, in Tel Aviv, for 2 years first, gradually got me to appreciate the human dimension, to see people not as categories, but as individuals, and as people who are, frankly, like any other people, that reminded me of my family and friends, and had more or less the same aspirations and fears and so on. But probably more importantly is that my work as a diplomat showed me something that probably if somebody had told me I wouldn't have understood, is that as a diplomat, you can't force people to accept things. So you have to reason with people, and you can't convince them to do something unless you understand where they're coming from, and unless you understand what their motivation is, what their concerns are, so that you can think of something that would be acceptable to them, and just changing the mindset from being, judgmental, what is international law saying, why aren't you do this, and so on, to try to be in the other person's shoes, made all the difference. not just in my work, but in my life and in my relationship to everybody who's different from me. And that's one thing that I brought with me, I think, from the diplomatic experience. And I'll stop here.
My name is Bernard Avishai. I teach political economy in the government department. I have to admit that when I was told that we would start out with some personal reflections, I was a little skeptical. And now I see that probably was a good idea. Susanne said, we are not categories. And maybe that's the virtue of starting this way. We are not categories. I started out as a category. I was the son of a Zionist leader in Canada, and after he died in '72, went to live in Israel. I was in Israel during the '67 war, and I knew something about the dread that came in advance of that war and a corresponding sense of euphoria that came. I was in Jerusalem the day it was declared, as it were, united. Moved there in '72 and have been living in Jerusalem on and off and writing about this conflict on and off for 50 years. I was a West Bank settler at one point. I was in the French Hill in East Jerusalem, and I thought at the time, well, you know, it's sort of in the land between where Jews live in Jerusalem and where the Hebrew University was being built, so what the hell, you know? I mean, it's not really not Israel. And it took me many years to become much more sensitive to the importance of thinking about people in more individual ways. I made many friends in East Jerusalem. I've taught in Libya. I know many people in Jordan. Human beings all. And I'll have more to say about that fairly soon.
So my name is Susanne Heschel. I grew up in New York City. My father was a professor of Jewish theology, and he became involved when I was a child in the civil rights movement and also in the movement against the war in Vietnam. So political issues were important to me. I originally was in love with the Bible and thought that would be my field, but then I went to visit some graduate schools. And, I'll give you an example. I sat in on a seminar, and the professor had a verse from a psalm, I think, and something like, "The gates of the city sing the praises of the Lord." And the professor said, "What do you mean gates don't sing?" So obviously there's a mistake in the Bible. And so we spent the whole 2 hours redoing the verse till he finally concluded, no, on the gates of the city were written the praises of the Lord. And at that point, I decided that there was a pathology to biblical scholarship. And I wanted to investigate, where does this come from? So my interest is really in the history of biblical scholarship and why they ask the questions they ask and why they have no sense of poetry and literature. And so I wrote my first book on 19th century biblical scholarship, a second book on the Nazi period about Protestant theologians in Germany who supported Hitler. And then I wrote a book on the history of Jewish scholarship on Islam. Thanks to grants from the Ford Foundation, I was able to do some work in Cairo, and then I also went with Professor Smolin and Professor Ella Reese to Beirut, to the American University, where we went to a conference. And I'm very interested in that. I'm interested in what happened in this period that I work on, which is the 19th, early 20th century. I think about figures, I'll just mention, there was Gottlieb Leibniz, a Hungarian Jew who founded the University of the Punjab in the 1870s and then moved to England, where he built the first mosque outside London in Woking. I think of Joseph Horowitz, who was a professor of Arabic at the Aligarh Muslim University in India from 1907 to 1914. Yes. Isn't that amazing? Or I think of Max Herz, who founded the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo and restored the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo and many other places. So that's become another interest of mine, the Jewish fascination with Islam and scholarly study of Islam, especially of the Quran. And so this is my engagement, and I'm just so glad to be at a university where we have such a wonderful community of scholars in these fields, and also the collegiality that we may teach courses together. So we have questions that have already been submitted, and I'm sure more questions will arise. Do you want to begin by telling us some of them?
All right. It's a long question, so I'll just read the first half, I think. How can we have civil, productive conversations about a topic that is so emotionally and historically charged, especially when there is so much disinformation?
Pass this on to.
Do you want to start?
I'd be happy to. One thing I remind myself over these days is, of course, the importance of principles and values and being guided by principles and values. What are your principles and values? What is it that you cling to? Not when it's convenient, not when it's comfortable, not when it's popular, but when it's hard, when you're emotional and you don't want to pay attention to that. And so for me, principles and values are respect for human beings, is human rights, is rule of law, is freedom of expression. But freedom of expression, of course, should be respectful. And I think using those principles, at least for me, and values as guiding, as what guides interactions, what guides my exchanges, my encounters, regardless of what is going on around me, is absolutely crucial. No matter how emotional, uncomfortable, frustrated I may be, it is always these principles and values that guide my path.
Do you want to take a stab at that? Do you want to answer the same question?
Well, I'll just say what I said on Tuesday at the beginning, which is very much in line with what you were saying, Jonathan. I actually looked at the voting patterns of the young people and the members of the kibbutzim who were killed on Saturday. Overwhelmingly, we're dealing with people who have been supporting the peace movement and the peace camp in Israel consistently for the last 25 years. And the young people who were killed, particularly, on the Sabbath, so if they're going to a rave concert on the Sabbath, you have to imagine what kind of secular Tel Aviv world we're talking about. We're also speaking, even retrospectively, that they went to a concert to celebrate peace and love. They were people who, I will bet, if you ask them, do you believe in a reciprocal, independent Palestinian state or Palestinian entity in confederation with Israel where Palestinians have all the rights that we have? Their answer would have been uniformly yes. And they were turned into a category when they were shot. At the same time, I called my friend Khalil Shikaki, who is Palestine's probably most famous and original survey researcher. And the last time Gaza was polled, in May of 2021, in advance of elections that were scheduled, Hamas barely scratched 30% popularity among Gazans. So we have to remember that when civilians are killed by Israeli artillery or Israeli jets, 2 out of 3 of the people who are getting killed are not even Hamas supporters, let alone Hamas operatives. The problem is precisely that you get turned into a category by heinous crimes like this. And when Jonathan says we have to remember our values, the way I translate that is we have to remember that democratic norms are really a function of a determination to see people as having an individual dignity. And no country, no nation is a monolith.
Susanna, the rest of the question says, because emotions are high, anything you say is bound to offend somebody. And so what is the solution? Should one just stay silent? Stay silent.
So one thing that we learn as scholars is never to be satisfied with a simple narrative, and never to think that we've come to a final conclusion. Whatever scientific experiment we may conclude today, there'll be one that overrides it in the future, and the same is true for historians. But the reduction to a simple narrative is something that I find very dangerous. We offer classes here. We encourage all of our students here, come take a class. Come attend one of our lectures, one of our workshops. Inform yourselves. We also want to clarify, since it's been raised as a question, in understanding, in studying something, it doesn't mean we condone or we agree. We have courses here on racism, on enslavement, on Nazism, on fascism. We don't endorse those. I don't become a Nazi when I write a book about Nazis. So that's important to be said. We obviously, without question, I would take everyone on this panel, everyone in this room. The slaughter of human beings is something that we condemn without question. It's the fundamental thing that makes us a human being. We don't kill other people, period, under any circumstances, for any reason, and there's no justification. I would add to it, it doesn't accomplish anything. So when we speak to one another, perhaps we have to recognize our own limitations, the limitations of our knowledge, the limitations of the information that we're being provided, to be aware that we should not try to learn what's going on from TikTok. We have the great privilege at Dartmouth of having access to newspapers from around the world, online, through our library. And we also have colleagues, professors that we can consult. So let's also remember that people are raw. The most important thing right now is to be kind, not to try to win arguments or denounce or even issue a statement. Why do you have to issue a statement? What does that accomplish? It's a little bit narcissistic. Here I am, here's my opinion, which may or may not be a valid opinion, I don't know. Let's be kind to one another. Let's treat people the way we want to be treated. Let's keep it at that level right now, because everyone is raw and suffering.
I want to say something about this question, and then we move to the next question. And I understand that emotions are high. I know everybody has strong emotions about it, but I want you to ask yourself, especially students, when you talk about the topic, what are you trying to achieve? Are you advocating? Are you trying to understand what is happening? Or are you trying to find someone to blame? And those are different things. And you're entitled to do all three or some of the three. It's entirely in your right to just be indignant at this or at that, and to stay at this level because emotions are raw, and this is where you are, and that's fine. The same thing if you want to advocate, if you want to become party to the conflict because you care about your people, you want to advocate for your people, it's entirely in your right. The last one is the one I am more interested in, and the one that I think we have an advantage in as a college, which is to try to understand what is going on, which means understand the complexity, which is often unpleasant because we come across things that we don't like. But that's, in fact, as students, as learners, that's our job here. And if we're not doing that, we will be, you can do this from home. You don't have to go to an Ivy League university in order to be indignant. Everybody gets indignant. The opportunity you have here is to learn, and to learn different perspectives. They're not the same. But then you learn a method of how you approach a complex issue that is charged, and maybe you can find out something useful other than the one you started with. That's what learning is about. Again, if you're at the indignation level right now, that is perfectly fine, but I want you to think about that. Maybe there is something in there that would be useful for you. Your questions. Next question.
Okay. This is a multi-part question, but I'm going to take the third here. There have been news articles, such as from The Guardian, claiming U.S. CEOs are trying to gather names of Harvard students showing support to Palestinians during this time. This seems like a lot like doxing. Some students at Dartmouth feel unsafe publicly showing support to Palestinians. What are your thoughts about this? And I think this connects directly with what Ezzedine was just talking about, right? That going back to at least what we were talking about earlier in terms of values, right? Freedom of expression, of democratic principles, of individual dignity, of respect. This is bedrock material. And anyone who feels like they cannot express themselves at a place, at a university where we are founded on exchange of ideas and learning new viewpoints and being uncomfortable but learning from discomfort, in terms of our personal growth. It's unacceptable if there's any blockage to that. And if there is, email me, jonathansmolin@dartmouth.edu. Okay? It's completely unacceptable. We are a community of free exchange of thought. Now, this is a difference from indignant condemnation, which is, as Ezzedine is mentioning, which is certainly not trying to suppress that, right? And that's, of course, freedom of expression. But without a doubt, exchange, that we should all feel comfortable and we should all feel like we have a place in order to express ourselves, our emotions, but also our ideas and our thoughts. Others?
I just want to say, in a way, I'm answering the last question again. Ezzedine and I teach a course together on Israel and Palestine. And at the beginning of the year, when we introduced ourselves, we each said in our own way, we're probably going to disagree about a lot of things. And the truth is that, sure, we may have some disagreements, or we may be reading different texts and coming to different conclusions. But the thing that we both had together when we went into this was a sense of tragedy. And I feel like there's nothing more precious than a sense of tragedy. Anybody who feels that they must make a demonstration of affiliation, either with Israelis or Palestinians today, should certainly not feel in any way that they're going to be either harming themselves publicly here or compromising their future in some way. That's completely unacceptable. At the same time, the way one makes one's sense of affiliation known is telltale. Are you showing a sense of affiliation for people whom you love, or people whom you feel have suffered indignity or suffered injustice? Absolutely. But at the same time, that does not mean justifying the action of anyone with whom you feel that sense of affiliation, if that action was inhumane. that's how Plato starts the Republic. Questioning whether justice is just doing what's good for your friend. Justice is not just doing what's good for your friend.
And as a side note, if I may, I do hope that the Dartmouth community understands what a rare opportunity it is to have a course on the Israel-Palestine conflict taught by a major Egyptian diplomat and a Israeli public intellectual, team taught. This is incredibly rare and a wonderful opportunity for you.
Speaking of Egypt, I have a question. Why is Egypt reluctant to open a corridor for safe passage? And there is with it a question about what role do foreign governments have in this role. So I'll answer the first one and then leave it to you too. So again, it's a complicated story and I'll try to make it simple. Israel imposed a full siege on Gaza, including cutting off fuel, water supplies, and food supplies until the hostages are released. Egypt sent a convoy with fuel and food and what have you, and then Israel opposed and said if the convoy crossed into Gaza, they will bomb it, and then bombed the Rafah crossing on the Palestinian side 3 times within 24 hours, enough for the Egyptian government to get the message, and the convoy turned back. Egypt since then has been trying to convince Israel to allow that corridor into Gaza. So we're talking about there are 2 different things. Safe passage of assistance into Gaza, even with a limited ceasefire to allow for this to go in. The other issue is allowing Gazans to leave Gaza Strip and go to Sinai. On the latter, the Egyptian government is adamant not to allow this. And that's in coordination with the Palestinian Authority, because collectively, the Palestinians and the Arab side has a memory since 1947 and 48 that people who leave, even momentarily, to flee the conflict are not allowed back. That's the story, how the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, how the story started. So for this, Egypt is kind of, until today, is adamant not to let the Palestinians of Gaza go to Sinai. Having said that, I think last I checked this afternoon, the number of Palestinian IDPs, the people who fled their homes, fearing that they will be destroyed or their homes were actually destroyed, reached almost 500,000. Now they are housed in UNRWA, United Nations Relief Work Agency, in UNRWA's schools and camps and so on. I fear, and I'm not the only one, that the number is going to grow, and then it will become untenable even for UNRWA to sustain this number, and then things might develop. So this is where the situation is.
My understanding is that this came up in the conversations with Anthony Blinken and the Israeli government this afternoon, or this morning for us. And I suspect that there will be more to this story. Obviously, there's aid coming into El Arish Airport, and there's got to be some kind of corridor which will have to be monitored in some way by international agencies. I have a question here. How do the latest developments affect Israel and normalization talks and its relations with other Middle Eastern countries? It's a wonderful question. I'm actually trying to write something about this now. It's been said again and again that this attack on Saturday was somehow the death knell of American efforts at normalization, that the Saudi, how did Ian Bremmer say, the Saudi deal is off the table. which is another way of saying that America's effort to create a diplomatic track for regional integration and normalization has somehow been obviated by this attack. I think that is a tremendous mistake. It's a mistake to think it, and it would be a tremendous mistake for America to operate under that principle. And I got the sense this afternoon watching Blinken's press conference that somehow he understands it. You know, during the '73 war, the first war I covered, Henry Kissinger gave Israel a chance to surround the Egyptian Third Army, if you remember. But he very carefully and very deliberately did not let the Israelis bombard it, because he realized that the '73 war was a crisis that was too good to lose, that it had a diplomatic opportunity attaching to it. The same is true here. The Saudi initiative had what was often reported to be a very minor codicil, which is, yes, we'll have to do something for the Palestinians, but just enough so that Mohammed bin Salman will not be embarrassed too much in pursuing his normalization. In fact, the Saudi initiative has been held up. The Saudi normalization has been held up because of the Palestinian question. But it's also true that both from the American point of view, there was no effort to really push the Palestinian issue or to elevate the prestige of the Palestine Authority in these negotiations, to provide an alternative track with which to envision Palestine independence, the end of the occupation, and some kind of confederal system in which the Israelis could live with. I think the American government today has a tremendous opportunity under the rubric of the Saudi plan to elevate the Palestinian national rights in ways that they have not been willing to do before. In a way, it's absolutely essential that they do so. Essential because if this war continues as it looks like it's going to continue, it's the very time that Palestinians who are not affiliated with Hamas have to feel that they have some kind of political horizon. That cannot come from the Israeli government today. It can only come from the American government.
In connection with that, I think perhaps we're aware that the feeling in Israel among those who voted for Netanyahu, the support at this point for Netanyahu is tiny. It's dropped dramatically. There's rage at him and his government, at their incompetence, at their stubbornness, and it's clear that Israel also will emerge with a very different political scenario. I have to also just say that I was on a Zoom with Jim Zogby yesterday, and he said Shikaki's numbers were actually elevated. He said that the support for Hamas in Gaza was only at 15 or 16%. Hamas does not represent Gazans and shouldn't be conflated any more than Netanyahu and his government represent Israelis or Jews. So that is sometimes confused and should be clarified. But yes, it's hard to think of anything good coming of such a horror, but if anything does happen, it's clear that there will be a different political scenario. And I believe, Ezzedine, we were talking about Egypt, the situation in Egypt right now is rather dire. It's not clear that Sisi will survive this.
Yes. I want to remind you that you can ask for the microphone and ask questions directly. You don't have
questions?
to.
Yes. Go ahead.
My questions are completely invisible. That's not my job, but I meant you're my client's time, and I have to do justice with many important questions. I haven't folded the note because they tend to repeat themselves. So I'll orally repeat, and it's important.
Excellent.
So do you want the microphone to ask?
Can you all hear me?
The question?
Yes, they can't.
Yes. So Thank you. I'll repeat, this is a question that several participants, there's of course, the feelings are very raw and indignation, both violence and trust done to people in Israel and Gaza, and that's palpable in many of the notes. I'm thinking, Professor Heschel and other caution against sheer indignation, but there's a genuine question behind the indignation, and I'd be doing an injustice to my clients if I don't repeat this. A recurring question is sometimes it's an open question, sometimes it's a statement that either Israel generally or the Israeli rule over Palestinians is a form of apartheid. Now, otherwise, I would say maybe we don't need this evening. But there's an important, and that's a legitimate and important claim. But there's a question behind this that I think I feel very strongly should be conveyed, and is a moral question. Is from that point of view, what do you feel are the legitimate borderlines? What are the legitimate contours of legitimate resistance to what people feel is an unjust apartheid system or occupation? And that's an important question, which was repeated several times. I'd like to communicate.
Okay. Let me take the second question about the right of resistance, because again, as an Egyptian, and even when I was in Jerusalem, I was there during the Second Intifada. Those were the most violent years, 2000 all the way to 2005. And every time we would talk to Hamas or other militants about the use of violence, the question of the right of resistance will come up. So let me say what I know about that right of resistance. I'm not a professor of international law. I took, enough courses to be able to tell what is what. Without the question of apartheid. So even without going there, which I prefer because that's another. International law grants occupied people the right to resist occupation. Number one. International law grants occupying powers the right to suppress resistance. What international law does is not end occupations. What international law does is organize the boundaries of occupation in the same way that it doesn't abolish war, but tells you what is acceptable and what is not acceptable during war. What is not acceptable for resistance or for suppression is targeting civilians under any circumstances. And targeting civilians in international law is different from a collateral that is civilian. Targeting civilians is placing a bomb in a coffee shop or a bus. International law also prohibits the occupying power from bombing heavily populated area, because even if you're not targeting civilians, you are bound to hurt civilians. That's what international law says. So the question of terrorism is not covered by the legitimate right of resistance. International law defines civilians not as people who are completely innocent of occupation, but as people who are not in active service of the army. So even if I'm a soldier in the occupying army and I am on leave, I'm on my way to the unit or on my way home from the unit, I am a civilian. If you're asking about international law, that's international law. You can take the rest of the question. I'm sorry. Just one more thing.
Yeah.
Having said that, the question about using resistance, even the legitimate resistance, like fighting an occupying army, the question is not whether you have the right to do this or not. That's an important question. But there is another important question, in my view more, which is it a good idea to do it? What are the expected consequences of your action? And that brings the question of heavily populated areas. If I am a freedom fighter who lives in a very crowded area, and I have my operation in that crowded area, and then I go and I shoot at a soldier, and I know that they're going to come back and bomb the entire neighborhood, is this really a good idea? Can I tell my people, let alone the occupying power, can I tell them it's legitimate? And what do you expect the occupying power to do when you shoot at its soldiers? Just like, right, we're occupying, we're out of here, or are they going to come after you? So the political dimension cannot be fully dissociated from the legal question.
Look, I've had to give the thought of what really qualifies as terrorism I had to give it a good deal of thought. My own stepsister was killed by a terrorist, and I since the early 70s, I've been thinking about, well, what really qualifies as terror? What's the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter? And I won't speak now to the question of whether or not the occupation of the West Bank and of Palestinian territories is in any way legitimate. There are some in Israel who say, well, this is contested land, et cetera. Well, they're contesting it, so they call it contested land. But it's not. I think according to international law, it's pretty clear that the occupation is a violation of the Geneva Conventions insofar as it puts Israelis on the other side of what used to be called the Green Line. I accept that. But now I'm thinking of this in a slightly different way. What qualifies as terrorism? What's the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter? To me, if you are fighting for your freedom, but you have reasonable, nonviolent ways of achieving your end, that should be the default. If you feel you have absolutely no nonviolent ways of achieving your end, then, like, for example, Hitler's occupation of Ukraine. If there is no reasonable, nonviolent way of achieving your end, then legitimate resistance would mean attacking the armed military of the occupier. I would have to say, if I were persuaded that the Palestinian population of the West Bank, leave Gaza aside for a moment, the Palestinian occupation of the West Bank, left absolutely no way of entertaining a nonviolent resolution of that conflict, I would say that a Palestinian freedom fighter, much as it hurts me to say this, would have a moral justification for killing an Israeli soldier, even if that soldier would be our own grandson or son. I see it morally. I see the logic. I don't see the logic of turning people into some category which allows you to kill people at random. That anyone who falls into this bucket dies. And I also don't accept the idea that Palestinians have no reasonable, nonviolent way of achieving statehood or confederal relation with Israel.
What did you say about us disagreeing?
Wait. I know.
I'm just bracketing.
No, I know. Ezzedine and I have come up with points in our course several times over the last 40, 50 years where we feel we're getting close, and somehow the diplomatic process unravels. As someone who lives in Israel and is fighting for the result that I say has been out of reach, I believe that our side can win. And I also believe that Palestinians, who, by the way, when you go to Ramallah, as I've been many, many times, Palestinians are constantly asking questions about political processes in Israel and seem to have more interest and expertise about the Israeli political party system than many Israelis do. So
okay, we can have questions that people want to ask, okay? So we're going to, I have to make an announcement, first of all, that this event is being live streamed and recorded, and if you wish to see the recording, you contact the Dickey Center. It may take a day or two. I also have to announce that at 7 p.m. there's a candlelight vigil on the Dartmouth Green, and President Sion Beilock will be speaking there. Okay, so let's take some questions.
We have 4 or 5 questions here.
All right. Hello, I'm Andrew. So my question kind of stems from Tuesday, but I think it's pretty relevant.
Speak a little louder, closer to the microphone.
Yeah, so I think my question kind of carries over to today as well. Harvard President Gay released a statement saying she condemns the terrorist atrocities perpetuated by Hamas. The NBA said they condemn these acts of terrorism and they stand with the people of Israel. President Biden said the brutality of Hamas brings to mind the worst rampages of ISIS. Other institutions aren't shying away from condemning Hamas, but Dartmouth is. Dartmouth said the violence and deaths are heartbreaking, but they did not condemn Hamas. On Tuesday, some of you echoed this ambiguous language. For example, Professors Heschel and El Ariz said they, quote, condemned violence, but they wouldn't summarily condemn Hamas. I know that every one of you would condemn Hamas if I asked you directly. But it's clear what's going on when someone says they condemn violence rather than Hamas. Obviously, everyone condemns violence. The wording of condemning violence clearly obfuscates who you're condemning and attempts to imply an all sides are bad narrative, downplaying the notion of a single aggressor. When Russia invaded Ukraine, sure, there were complicated dynamics at play, but nobody was saying they condemned the violence in the region.
Can you please ask the question?
Yes.
Could you please let her?
So this is very different. So Dartmouth's response was to openly condemn Russia, and this is very different from Dartmouth's response to Israel and Palestine. It seems like you're trying to strike a moral parity to not make Hamas's actions seem worse than Israel.
If you could ask the question.
Yes.
No,
Yes.
excuse me. No, please let him. What happened to save space?
Here's the question, sorry. So why don't you just come out and say it? Why don't you say you're hesitant to condemn Hamas because you don't want to imply one side is worse than the other?
Thank you. Let me take 3-4 questions and then we respond.
I want to say, we certainly condemn Hamas. It goes without saying. I cannot imagine that anyone wouldn't think that of me, really. You know, anyone who knows me knows that. And I think I've been pretty clear about that. And I think that President Beilock has also been clear, and the rest of the administration. There's some things that are just so obvious that sometimes it should not, if you don't understand that, then I think there is some confusion on your part. So we...
Hi, sorry, so I'll make this quick. How do you guys see sort of these events playing into sort of political support for extremism, especially like in both Israel and Palestine? We've got this rise of sort of the Kahanists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the new Israeli government, and how do we see this playing into support for Jewish extremism? How do we play this? There may be an election in Palestine in the next few years, hopefully. How do we see this playing into potential support for Hamas? How do we see, Israeli and Palestinian citizens feeling about this will it drive support for extremism? Sorry, I rambled on.
No, thank you. Excellent question.
Going off of that question and then what you were speaking of just now on the question of civilians and resistance, somewhere in the thousands of firearms are reportedly being distributed to Israeli civilians for what purposes are not explicitly clear, but seem implicitly around self-defense or potentially aggression. Following a summer, maybe a year or so, of some of the most extreme expansions that the Israeli settlements in the West Bank have seen. I think there's room to ask, to what extent does a country arming civilians or providing civilians with the ability to function as a militia, if not organized, complicate the barrier between, or the distinction between civilian and not civilian? And then to maybe push further on that, if you're talking about a country that is in a position of settler colonialism, where what is very much at stake in the ethnic cleansing is not a question of just the military versus the occupied population, but the actual civilian replacement of one population with another, how does that complicate or change the dynamics of the two civilian populations with respect to each other? I say this as somebody whose brother lives in the occupied West Bank as an Israeli settler, and it's a very painful thing to think about and talk about.
Thank you. There are two questions here. Also, if you can take.
We're taking too many. I mean, I feel like we can.
I think she's got some. Okay. Okay, I have a question here. I would love to hear some discussion about Egypt and its role historically in Gaza. I'm not talking about their role as a potential mediator going forward. I'm talking about Egypt's role in closing borders, refusing to provide aid, refusing to assist and welcome Palestinians. Historically, how that led to the situation in Gaza, and what should be done about Egypt's role and other Arab neighboring states' roles going forward.
Thank you. One last, and then we'll.
Hello, professors. How are you doing?
Yeah.
My question, all major international human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, even Israeli ones like B'Tselem, use the term apartheid to describe the Israeli treatment of Palestinians. But it seems like in a lot of these spaces, apartheid gets kind of dismissed and ignored as though it makes people uncomfortable. I would like to get your direct thoughts on apartheid and stop skirting around the question. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay. So do you want to start with the statement issue, the denunciation, or shying away from denouncing?
I'm not shying. None of us are shying away from that. But I'm not sure that we've had so many questions here. I'm not sure which one.
It seems to me that this is not a time for us to start picking apart this statement or that statement. It's not even clear to me that university presidents need to issue statements, what that accomplishes. I think it's a very simple way of being reductionist and really avoiding the complexity of the situation. That's not what we want to do as academics. We want to see the complexity and not try to reduce it to a sentence or two. So whether or not somebody formulates a sentence that you like or you don't like, it should have been formulated this way or that way, that's a waste of time right now, in my opinion. There are more important things for us to be studying, to be thinking about, to be analyzing, to draw out and not reduce.
Let me see if I can put two questions together and answer you.
Ramsey.
You're a little distracted at the moment. I'm actually answering you. Okay. You ask if Israel's an apartheid state.
What are your thoughts?
Okay. I think that if you look at Jerusalem and the settlements, the way they conduct themselves and the attitudes of the people in Jerusalem and the settlements, what you have is an apartheid state. But that's not all of Israel. Israel also is a global, cosmopolitan, commercially free, culturally advanced, technologically interesting state in Tel Aviv, Haifa, the coast, and that megalopolis going up the coast is as different from Jerusalem as New York is from rural Mississippi. Okay? And it's very important that you understand that there's a fight going on in the country for control over the state apparatus by people who have a very different understanding of what Israel must be. Not greater Israel, but global Israel. Okay? That fight is going on, and that answers your question about this last war and what it's going to do to the politics of the countries. Obviously, in the first 5 days after this attack, everybody is mobilized for what feels like war, and in the state of war, the differences between religious Zionists and their dream palace ideas about what the West Bank is are all going to be submerged. Those ideas are also all going to be submerged. The differences that you have in Tel Aviv to that vision, those differences will be submerged in a state of mobilization. Once the mobilization ends, I can tell you those differences are going to resurge, and there's going to be a tremendous price paid precisely by the people who helped instigate this. And by the way, many of the soldiers who should have been on that border were busy suppressing the disturbances among Palestinians to activities of West Bank settlers. And they should have been there and not patrolling the West Bank, and people in Tel Aviv know it. There's going to be a price to be paid here. And in my view, we're never going to have a more clarifying moment than the day after the day after.
I want to just remind everyone we have this room only until 6:30. So let's keep our questions and answers to the point.
Just on the question of the political consequences, which I think is, it's a great question. Obviously, the attack, the Hamas attacks, and then the expected Israeli response, which is unfolding now, both will mobilize, support, and kind of harden identities on both sides. If you think about it, that actually might be one of the strategic goals of the attacks itself. The severity of the attack, the scale of the attack, the type, the brutality of it is almost designed to elicit a specific response, and that response is going to mobilize the Arab world behind not those who are seeking to find a solution to the conflict, but those who are actually riding the conflict, specifically Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and so on. So we need to, I'm not in the mind of Hamas, but that's the only kind of sense I can make of that attack. And the question is whether we kind of walk into this path or try to pull the parties from this path. That's all.
Bravo.
And I want to quickly, just because the question of apartheid and the question of statements and denunciation, they're a kind of mirror. And I want to ask you a question. Frankly, I'm asking not a rhetorical question. As a student, as a person, what does it matter to you what I or Bernie think about apartheid?
I would like to hear an educated and academic voice on the issue.
Okay, so would you like to hear kind of analysis? What does the question mean, apartheid? Why certain people are pushing it? What are they trying to achieve? Where are they coming from? Why others feel that it's anti-Semitic to point out Israel as, and what are they trying to do by opposing the question? And the politics around this on campuses and elsewhere, is this more interesting to you? Or what does Ezzedine Fishere think about apartheid? It's a serious question.
With all due respect, I hold your opinion very highly, so I would not mind hearing what you think. I respect what you have to say.
Okay. I think the question is mute. I think the question is entirely political. It's a political operation, whether you actually follow Amnesty and Human Rights Watch or you oppose it. Either way, it's a political issue. Is there discrimination in Israel? Yes. Is the discrimination systematic? Yes. Is there occupation? Yes. Is there suffering? All of those questions, nobody's contesting that. Do you want to label it as apartheid? Then that's a political question. Why do you want to label it as apartheid? What are the consequences of that?
Apartheid is more than just a label. It has a series of very serious repercussions and implications which would seriously affect how internationally we respond to what's going on. So it's much more than just a label. It's a very serious issue, and I think this entire forum is for asking the important political questions. That's why I asked the question. I hope I didn't strike you as an operative or something like that.
No, it doesn't. No. I just disagree that the answer to the question has all those repercussions, legally or politically. Why? Because the players, whether they're states or non-states, are aware of those repercussions, theoretical repercussions, and therefore prevent the question from coming to that. So the question itself and the answers given to it is part of the political conflict.
May I just say there's one aspect of this question of apartheid that becomes very misleading. The apartheid regime in South Africa had, just a moment, it's important to understand what Israel has become. The apartheid regime in South Africa didn't just institute discriminatory policies. It was a white settler colonial population that exploited a black indigenous community for their labor and resources. That has never actually happened in Israel. Israel did not, the Zionist movement did not create a settler population that was exploiting an indigenous population. The damage it did to the Palestinians was precisely that it wanted to be economically independent of the Palestinian population and created a society that was independent politically and economically from the Palestinian population. Its damage to the Palestinian population was in the way that it moved the Palestinian population aside. That I will certainly want to deal with. But apartheid gives us an image of what Israel is, which if you don't understand the place and have never been there, you can't possibly understand how something like Tel Aviv can exist and how the science and technologies and the companies that exist there without any Arab workers at all exist. So getting this idea that somehow this is an apartheid state just feels to me a completely misleading thing.
Okay, we're going to move on for more questions, all right? Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. Ezzedine.
Hi. You talked a lot about how Hamas does not actually represent the Palestinian people, which is a point I 100% agree with. This is sort of a two-part question, but first of all, do you believe that endorsing an attack by Hamas, which is an explicitly anti-Semitic organization, is in and of itself an anti-Semitic position? And on that point, do you believe that student organizations which are affiliated with the Palestinian rights movement should be able to endorse the Hamas attack in public forums or through mass email, especially when so many students that they are talking to have lost family members or friends in these attacks?
Do you want to collect a few other questions? Any last questions? Yes, please. Here in the front.
Okay, given the kind of atrocities that are happening in Israel and Gaza right now, what do you think is like most likely fate of Palestinians that is going to happen in future? Do you think it's always at any time going to subside, or is it going to continue as a war forever? What will happen to people who live there?
Wait, any others? Yes, here?
Yeah, I have a question about the hostages. Our hearts all go out for the people that are being held hostage in Gaza. And it seems like the Israeli government's stance, and I might be oversimplifying here, is that give us back the hostages or we're going to keep bombing you. And the bombs that are going off are killing and making homeless more and more Palestinians. So I guess the question that I have is, it seems like the assumption is that if they bomb enough and create enough misery, that Hamas will give up the hostages. I guess my question is, does Hamas leadership really care how many Palestinians die?
Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question from you about why it seems that the U.S. state is pretty ubiquitous in its support ideologically and economically for Israel, and what are some of the historical and maybe the strategic reasons for this, and how do you recommend that we voice our disagreement, if we have it, with this support when this opposes essentially every powerful institution that really shapes our lives?
Thank you.
I've also received a question, a note question. What can the United States do to de-escalate the war now? And what can we as students and faculty do to help such a de-escalation?
Would you like to respond to one of the questions, Susanne?
Yes, just quickly, we have just a few minutes, and I wanted to say that in response to this question and to the question of resistance, there are many forms of resistance, and I believe very strongly that since we are here at a university, we have to think in terms of ideas. Judaism itself has been completely reconfigured in the last 30 years or so. We see that in Israel and also outside Israel, and that's highly problematic to me. And that reconfiguration, redefinition, which is contrary in many ways to very fundamental ideas and principles of Judaism, that's deeply troubling. And we need to answer. We need to also win readers for our ideas and for our opposition to that. I say that just as a professor of Jewish studies, it's only one aspect. But for all students and faculty, ideas are very powerful. We need to formulate them. We need to take classes to study. If you want to make a difference, and if you want to act in resistance to what has been developing over these years, to the suffering and the misery, then your ideas are important. Write, study, think, analyze. That matters a lot. That's why we exist as a university. In terms of the de-escalation right now, I have a lot of, I have hope, even as I have despair and I have rage. I don't trust the current government in Israel. I certainly don't trust Hamas. I do think there are a few people right now whom I respect. Jake Sullivan was here as a Montgomery Fellow. I met him, and I actually respect him a great deal as a human being. I feel the same way about the Secretary of State, Blinken, who's there now. I do think that we have good people here. I wish that Reverend Jesse Jackson were in good health, because he was able over the years to rescue hostages in many circumstances. I think that theologians and religious leaders also have a role to play here, because we're dealing with very hardened hearts on many sides of this conflict. And having grown up at the time of the civil rights movement, I do believe that religion, that the Bible, that Scripture, whether it's Quran, New Testament, Scripture can soften hardened hearts. So those of you who are interested in becoming clergy or studying religion and becoming theologians, and I encourage you to take classes in the religion department here, religion can also be a very powerful tool. It's not just about secretaries of state and defense people. We all, in addition, can write to the White House, can write to the Congress, and we can also express our voices in our newspapers and journals that also need to hear from us and our support.
Right. I'm going to pick one easy question for you, and that's the question of student associations and freedom of expression and support for terrorism. How do you...
I want to follow up on something that Susanne is saying here, which I think is, this is connected, which I think is absolutely crucial, is that I remember what it was like being a college student. And I remember feeling this kind of, becoming an adult and learning about yourself and and feeling a sense of kind of, perhaps insignificance or unimportance or inability to really make a difference, right? But you make a difference by impacting the people around you, by the influence you have through your daily actions, through the things that you write, through the interactions that you have, through the engagement. You have a platform as being a Dartmouth student. You are a lifelong Dartmouth student or citizen of Dartmouth. You have the ability to go now and on to have your voice heard if you choose to do that in media, in writing in a variety of different forms, and all kinds of other different contexts. And so seize that opportunity, recognize the position and the opportunity that you have, and move forward to have your voice heard. And think of it not as something that, there's a quick fix or a quick response, that it's a lifelong endeavor to have your voice heard. and influencing people and impacting them and connecting and being influenced and impacted is a day in, day out on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. I think about these things all the time, and I hope I have many more years to go. But I really feel passionately about having your voice heard in the many different opportunities and ways on a day in, day out basis, and having faith that that is a way to influence and impact not just the people around you, not just only to leave a legacy, but to change the world.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to have my voice heard in a moment. Just a moment.
I pick one question for you.
No, because there are two that haven't even been addressed.
I know. One is about how the fact that it's a settler colonial, how does this complicate the question of terrorism? It's an important question.
Well, I feel like, honestly, Ezzedine, I feel like I've tried to deal with that. I want to deal with the question of American policy.
It's great to monitor, moderate academics.
Because
or monitor them either.
We have 7 minutes left to this room. 7 minutes we have to leave the room.
I can see the clock right over here. But I feel like there are two questions that were raised here have been completely ignored. One is about whether Israel believes that by bombing Gaza, it'll get the hostages released. And one is about American foreign policy. Okay. Obviously, in 7 minutes, I'm not going to have much to say. I do want to, however, respond. I don't think it's Israel's strategy to bomb Hamas in order to get the hostages returned. I don't believe. I think right now there's a rather, I would say, almost callous sense that there's a bigger strategic problem Israel has, and it's got to deal with that. And in the same way that it's putting its own soldiers in harm's way, the hostages may wind up being victims of that larger strategic problem. About America, I will only say that there was a moment when American foreign policy somehow pivoted to thinking of Israel as a strategic asset in the Middle East. I think that continues at some level, but I think America has also understood that to the extent that the Middle East blows up, that its own interests can be compromised. And Israel is, for America, for quite a while now, both this strategic asset on the one hand, and also this problem child that needs to be somehow educated to some larger regional opportunity, which I think is now the default position of the American government, that the real opportunity is to follow what the Abraham Accords started, which is the integration of Israel into the region, and to try to solve the problem of Palestine from the outside in rather than inside out.
All right, so I will answer the question that my colleagues wisely avoided, which is about student advocacy. And I'm not an arbiter of what should be banned and what should be allowed, but I will address both Arab and Jewish students and remind you of two things. One is advocating for your rights, for the rights of the people you care deeply about, doesn't have to be incitement against the other group. It really doesn't. There is no connection between the two. And the second thing is here at Dartmouth, one of the things that made me stay, I was here only for a year, is that I found this is one of the only very few campuses in the United States where you can actually talk about these issues and reach out across, the divide, ruining that because one wants to be righteous and wants to be or feel angry is really unwise and unworthy. We're all students here. We're not fighting each other. People are fighting back there. We're supporting them. There is absolutely no point in bringing the fight here. So keep this in mind. Even if it's your legal right to do something, it is not always the decent thing to do. And when you have an ongoing grievance, especially like the Palestinians who live under occupation their entire lives and their parents have been suffering, it's an ongoing grievance. But one can actually be sufficiently sensitive when there is a catastrophe that is hitting the other group. Maybe it's not the right time to remind the other group of that grievance, and that's, haven't you done that? Maybe you would be, and so on. This is a disaster that happened, and we have to be sensitive about it. And sadly, there is another disaster that is happening now, and it's going to unfold in the coming days. And I expect also the other students to be sensitive about that. So I'm just reminding you of those things. You can throw what I say, somewhere, and I'm sure a lot of you might be tempted, but you might also want to consider that, just for a minute or two. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
I want to thank you all for coming. We will have future gatherings, and I look forward to seeing you there.